you all sleep well? Everybody was walking around here last night looking so tired. Yeah. I'm Sharon Kaplan, and we'd like to welcome you to the workshop this morning. This is the second opportunity we're having to do this workshop, and it's going to be kind of fun to listen to each other and see what kind of new and intriguing ideas we've come up with overnight. It says on the agenda that we're supposed to go 2 hours and 45 minutes, which is 45 minutes longer than the workshop yesterday, and we voted up here and decided that we didn't want to do that. So we may, in fact, stop at the end of 2 hours unless we're inundated with questions and let you stretch your legs a bit and enjoy each other's company. One of the things we'd love to know is who's in the audience. So maybe by a show of hands, how many of you are therapists, clinicians?
Not many.
Okay. How many of you are adoptive parents? And how many birth parents? Okay. And how many adoptees? Any significant others? Okay, I didn't ask that yesterday. I don't want to leave you out. Yes. Okay. Very different group than we had yesterday. This ought to make it kind of fun and interesting for us too. Well, welcome, and I'm going to turn the program over to Marilyn, and off we go.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Johnson. I'm going to talk first. I'm a birth mother, and then Sharon, and then Bob. I said I don't know how to make this more interesting for these two folks who are just going to have to sit and listen to it again, so I apologize. When I was asked to do this, initially asked to be on this panel, I said, sure, I'll do it, fine, I'll think of something to say when the time comes, and several months went by, and then the time came to have to think of something, and I really drew a blank. I am a psychotherapist, I'm a psychologist, but I do not work in adoption. I've seen very few adoptees, and when I have, that has not been the issue they came for. And so I thought, what could I add to this panel? And I decided, rightly or wrongly, that probably most workers in adoption, and that's who I assumed the audience would be, already knew that there was a lot of grief for the birth mother following relinquishment and from that time on. So I decided perhaps I could contribute something to talk about grief during and after reunion, because that's something I have been experiencing for the last 4.5 years. And I don't know about you, but my belief before reunion would have been that grief would have had no part in that all the grief would be gone and there would just be joy and happiness, and that would be wonderful. Well, that's not the case. So I think since adoption rights groups are more and more facilitating reunions, I would think it would be helpful for people in the triad as well as professionals to know something about what that's like. And the grief certainly is a part of that. So I want to be clear that I will be talking from my own experience, and I did attend a support group for about a year after my daughter and I were reunited through a registry, and got a lot out of that from hearing other people's stories. And so I learned some things from that that will also play a part in what I speak about today. I'd like to talk about 3 things: the emotions that birth mothers feel. That's the only person I can speak for. During reunions, whether they happen to be good or bad, some common events following reunion that evoke grief as well as happiness, and then finally I'd like to make a few suggestions for helping birth mothers manage their feelings, and particularly their grief after reunion. Let me just say, my daughter is in the audience today, and it seems very strange to be here talking about grief when I'm so happy she's here. Well, I feel both things, and that's really the theme of what I'm going to say. Let me just quickly go over the reasons why grief would stay unresolved for birth mothers. First of all, the person we relinquish is out there in the world someplace. So you're always thinking about that person. As I said, it's like our radar is always on. It may be turned low, but it's always going. And you always think, well, gee, maybe when I pick up the paper, I'll see a face that looks like mine, so forth. So that keeps it going. I think another thing is that, at least for the people of my generation, there weren't any formal support groups to help people grieve the loss. You were just kind of stuck. In fact, you were told to get over it, to just put it out of your mind and go on with your life. Well, we all know that can't happen. Another thing is that you don't have usually the father around to help you grieve, as you might if it were, God forbid, some other kind of loss. In fact, in many cases, the father abandons the mother. That didn't happen in my case, but that often happens. And then that's another loss you have to grieve while you're going through the loss of the child. And then finally, there is the fact that it was ultimately your decision to do what you did, that you were unable or unwilling to take the consequences of keeping the child. And so you always have that feeling of grief. I think there are two reasons why people in reunion feel grief, at least two that I think are probably universal. The first is that you relive the unhappy days of pregnancy and relinquishment and the period following relinquishment. You can't help but do that when you're in contact with this person again. And second is the fear that maybe you'll meet once and you'll never see each other again. And that feeling may persist for quite a long time. In fact, it may be a constant one. And that evokes grief as well. Let me define what I, just for myself, have defined as different types of reunions, where I think you always have those two sources of grief. The first, bad reunions, it seems to me from my experience in the group primarily, are reunions where the person is totally rejected, or where the person they find seems so different, so alien, that there's just no feeling of connection. I think that's very rare, but I occasionally saw something like that happen. So that birth mother in that case has to not only relive what she went through, but she has to try to accept the fact that there will never be a reunion, that now she knows who this person is and this person doesn't want her. I think much more common, or what for lack of a better term, I've called uncertain reunions. And by that I mean a reunion where the adoptee is ambivalent. Yes, they want some kind of reunion, but they're feeling very torn loyalties between you and their parents. And so they may distance you, hold you off quite a bit because of that. And I think at that time it's very hard for birth mothers because they don't know what's going to happen. The child kind of blows hot and cold for very good reasons, but try to tell us that. And so I think many of us get depressed, we get angry, and we had hoped to be included, and instead we feel we're being excluded. And in my experience, this seemed to be true of birth mothers who had other children and those who didn't. It wasn't just people who didn't have other children. There still was that feeling of connection with your child. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, that is about the uncertain reunions, because I think there's a lot of hope for those, and particularly with some ideas I have. The good reunions, I think, happen when both people want to meet, when they like who they meet, and when they can move at the same pace, even if it means one of them has to slow down for the other. But you have to remember that no matter how happy they are during the reunion, there are feelings of sadness. And here I can speak from personal example. Just anticipating meeting my daughter after she phoned me brought back all the memories of the only other contact I had had with her, which was giving birth to her and then losing her. I didn't start worrying about losing her again until I met her. I think it was just meet her. But then the minute I met her again, I thought, oh gosh, I don't want to lose her. Am I going to lose her? And that contrast, that juxtaposition of really being very happy and sad and really afraid that that would happen was very potent. It had gone very well, but until we made some plans, however tentative, to get together again, I was really afraid to let myself feel anything. After reunion, usually an uncertain or a good one, the two people will decide they want some kind of continued contact. And here again, a lot of experiences will happen to you which will make you sad as well as happy. In my case, I'm not married, I don't have other children, and I don't have a big extended family, and the family I have, my family of origin is spread all over the country, so I didn't have a lot of people to introduce her to. Some people do. Some people in the group had huge families, and sometimes the families are accepting. I think most of the times they are. Sometimes they're not. The family that she's met is very accepting. There's no problem. Let me quickly go through the events that I think can evoke grief, that always remind you that this is not the usual thing. First is just something as benign as visiting each other in your homes. You go in and you say, oh, this is who she is, because I think our homes do reflect us. She does the same for you. And you feel very at home there, and yet there's still the realization, let's say when you meet her friends, that they know her in some ways better than you know her. They've shared things with her that you have not shared. When Pat came to my home, she said it felt very comfortable and familiar, and that made me feel very good. And yet there were times when I had to realize she's never been here before. She doesn't know how to automatically come in and do this or that. Another important event for us was my being reunited with her birth father after 30 plus years, and then getting the two of them together. I hadn't seen him since shortly after she was born, and so seeing him evoked all the old memories of the pregnancy and the relinquishment again. And I felt good that we could all be together and that she could have this experience, but the expression time warp really came to mind, that here I was with these two people, and it seemed very unreal to me, probably to them too. The third event, which was a very happy one, was visiting Pat just before and just after she had her first child. And I learned a lot about that. I was saying yesterday that I think it was the day she was probably in labor. It was her due date, I think, and our deliveries were very much, our labors and deliveries were almost identical. It's really funny. But anyway, that day my own body felt very restless, and Bob and I are both dog lovers, it turns out, and I said if I'd been a dog that day, I would have taken socks into the closet and made myself a nest so I could have the puppies. That's just the way I felt. When I went to visit her, the baby was 6 weeks old, and when I looked at her, I said to myself, when Pat was 6 weeks old, she'd been with me for 10 days, she'd been in a transitional foster home, and she'd been with her family then for 3 weeks. And I looked at Allie, who was so little, and I thought, gosh, when Pat was so little, all those big things that happened to her that she had no say over, and that were going to have a lot of impact on her life. The other thing is, when I was taking care of the baby, of course I talked to her the way you do. And I remembered talking to Pat as a baby when I was changing her, and I was trying to tell this new baby about her, well, when your mother was a baby. And my memories were so impoverished. There were so few. It just made me feel so bad that I couldn't tell her much at all. And seeing Pat and the baby, now that Allie's going to be 3 next month, has really taught me a lot about mothers and children bonding, because I see how this day-to-day bond builds up, and it's given me a new appreciation for the relationship that Pat and her mother have. I always knew theoretically that they would be close, and there's no way you can supplant this, nor do I want to. But just seeing it has really been helpful to me, seeing her with her own child. The last important event, which I think happens fairly commonly, it didn't happen with us till after about 3 years, was my meeting her parents. And talk about a combination of happy and sad that day. I met them in the house they bought to satisfy the adoption agency that they had a good place to bring a baby home to. So this was the home she had lived in all her life. So it was full of memories for them. I was happy to meet her parents. I really liked them. I respected them. Felt a lot of connection, a lot of similarity between us. But I was always reminded there was a time when they were all discussing Allie's birthday party that was coming up. And I was very aware of being the outsider, sitting there listening to this go on. And my view is that that's reality. I mean, that's just the way life is. Um, in all these events I've talked about, there is this alternation of being happy and then being reminded of all the grief that you still have. And the best analogy I could think of was a slide projector. That sometimes when Pat and I are feeling really connected, we're talking on the phone or in person, it's like my vision gets out of focus, gets blurred, and all I see kind of is her and me. And then she'll say something or I'll say something, and I have to press the button and bring it into clear focus, where she's with everybody who loves her, and I'm just one of those people. And I do think it's important to be able to do that, because it seems to me that the birth mothers who have the greatest problems are the ones who can't press that focus button. And I think it only brings a lot more grief on you if you can't. Finally, let me just make some suggestions for how to be helpful. And let me say to the mental health people here that what I'm going to say is probably very obvious to you. But it seems to me that this is in many ways similar to a lot of grief experiences. Grief is grief. What's different here is that this is a person that you're going to be with, if you're lucky, off and on. And so you're going to have to keep having these feelings. It's not that you work it through and then it's gone forever. I think birth mothers should be encouraged, obviously, to talk things over, and not with their child necessarily. I mean, certainly talk things over with them, but I don't think the child needs to be burdened with every feeling you've ever had about everything. I personally feel that when I was in touch with her birth father again, I talked too much to her about it. She didn't need to know all that. But again, that's my feeling, and I have a great sense of privacy, and I think she does too. But I think birth mothers need a lot of people to talk to. I found it very helpful to hear people in the support group talk about their experiences. It normalized my experience. Oh, well, I'm not so weird to feel this way. Okay, and it was helpful to talk to those folks. There are certainly times when I think it's good and appropriate, being a mental health person myself, to talk to somebody like that if that's what you need to do. I think it's good to prepare her for the fact that she will feel sad, that this dream coming true doesn't mean that everything's going to be great. I think another thing to help her with is the timing of events. I mentioned to you a number of events that we went through over a 3.5-year period. Some people combine all of that in one fell swoop. You know, they meet the child, her parents, whatever, all in one time. I would have dissolved if I'd had to do that. I don't think I could have managed that. Mother, that if she can't do that all at one time, that's okay. I mean, you do things at your own pace, and don't feel guilty about it. The rest of what I want to say, I'd like to say to birth mothers, directly to birth mothers. And that is, do whatever you need to do to keep perspective to what's happening to you at this time. I kept saying when this happened to me, oh, I wish I had a book to read, you know, like a recipe. We'll do this, and then do this, and then you'll feel better, or you'll know what to expect. It was not knowing what to expect that I found so hard. And we are painfully sensitive to everything our child does and says. Oh, does this mean this? Oh, does this mean this? And it's really hard to keep perspective on your own. I personally believe that we relinquish our children for the children's sake, hoping that they'll have something better. And I think that idea of for the good of the child should obtain during reunion as well. We've been thinking about this for years and years. They may have or may not have, and if they were, they may not have known they were. I think it's really important not to pressure the child. I keep saying child, I'm sorry, God, she's 34. The person. I don't think it's fair to pressure them or to make them feel guilty or make demands, because often all that does is scare them away. It's hard not to do that, particularly if you're not sure where you stand. But they can't take our sadness away, and nor should they have to. I think we need to remember that in this world we can all, if we're lucky, in one way or other, have as many children as we want, okay, through adoption or whatever. Most people only have one mother, and your child already has one, okay, and your job is not to try to replace her, and for her to widen her world enough to let you in without dislodging other people, it's going to take time and it's going to take struggle for that person. And you can't expect it to happen instantly. And nor should you push them for that, I believe. They have very tight bonds with those people. Whether they get along with them or not, the bonds are still very tight. And there is time. I mean, I really learned that. There are things that I swore in the first 6 months I knew would never happen in our relationship. And they did. It took a long time, but they did happen. So you have to be patient. And I do think that maintaining that stance of patient caring, and patient is the operative word, really is the best way to turn a questionable reunion into a good one. So, in conclusion, finally, I do believe some grief in life is unresolvable. That is, there are things we just have to live with. We have losses in our life. I think we have to grieve them the best we can and then go on. I know right after Pat and I found each other, I kept going around asking myself and everybody around me, just ask them, how do I make sense of the 30 years between relinquishing her and being with her again? You know, in one way, it's like time collapses. One day I hand my baby over to a social worker. The next day I meet this grown woman and we hug and we start a relationship. Well, what do I do with all that? And I know that you can't do anything with it, but I still haven't figured all that out. But I personally feel that we have such a let's fix ourselves mania in this society that we have to work out all our problems so that we can be happy all the time. And I think that's nuts. I really do. And I think if we can accept that grief is a part of it, then we have more room for all the good things that happen. Thank you.
Good morning. If any of you in the back would like to sit down, there's plenty of floor space up here, so don't hesitate to come forward. My name is Sharon Kaplan, and I'm an adoptive parent, a social worker, a foster parent, and a parent by birth. And I can remember coming into the AAC several years ago and not feeling very welcome on several counts. Being a social worker and being an adoptive parent did not endear me much to the movement. Things have changed, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to be included in the fold because I think adoptive parents have a lot in common on a feeling level with birth parents and adoptees. And I'm sure that much of what I would share today as an adoptive parent will not be foreign to the rest of you in the triad. I think we are much more alike than we are different in terms of our feeling experiences. My husband and I have raised 12 children. They're all grown and gone, thank God. We have 4 grandchildren. The oldest I did give birth to. She is adopted by my husband. And then we adopted a few as older special needs children. And then other kids just started coming home over the years and stayed. And so we became long-term foster parents. So, like many of the birth parents in this room, and I'm not always sure when people ask me how many children I have exactly how to answer that question. My role definition is a bit fuzzy sometimes in terms of the general public's understanding of what parenting is. So I have to sometimes say, do you want to know the kids I'm legally connected to, the kids I birthed, or the kids I love and feel like I'm a parent to, or the kids who acknowledge me as a parent? Because some of the children came home from very difficult beginnings and were not able to attach to anybody. So the fact that I love them and parent them does not always mean that they are able to reach back and accept that. And I think that the stresses and strains that infertility places on families, and I am a product, if you will, of secondary infertility, a parent by secondary infertility. I think the stresses and strains that are put on adoptive families, both by infertility or secondary infertility, and then often by bringing children home, not always as babies, but often older, who've not had comfortable beginnings, creates for many adoptive families situations of separation and divorce, and that really is not an uncommon experience for adoptive parents. And I'd like to share a little bit about what I think pushes us in that direction. I also want to say that I think to the extent that adoptive parents deal with these issues, that's the extent to which they're going to be able to help their children come to terms with their issues of adoption. That if we are not able to acknowledge our pain and our losses, and in some way confront our grief, which is also in many ways unresolvable, we really cannot leave space for our children to talk about their pain and some of their unresolved issues. And often when I bring that up in a group, people will get angry at me, particularly if I'm talking to a group of adoptive parents. And I think part of the feeling is that we ought to be grateful and happy because, after all, we have children. And what's wrong with us? What difference does it make how they come home? But adoption does not cure infertility. And so those issues stay with us for life. Adoptive parents certainly experience a great many losses long before a child comes home and continues on through the lifetime of growing your children into adulthood. Like many birth parents and adoptees, we have a tremendous sense of loss of control, and beginning with control over our own bodies. We're unable to do what other people seem to be able to do fairly naturally. And then we have to go to all these middle persons, if you will, to reach our goal of parenthood. And that often impacts our self-esteem greatly. And we have to jump through a multitude of hoops to get to our goal. We literally have to be stamped with a stamp of approval by some agency personnel somewhere. And I remember coming back after our first home study visit for our first set of adoptions. We adopted a sibling set, a 3.5-year-old and 4.5-year-old, whose birth mother had committed suicide. The birth father was gone, and the birth family was not in a position to take the children in. And I had already been a social worker for several years. I had been doing home studies for several years. But in my gut, and I'm not talking here about things in our head, and I think we all know that there's a difference between what we intellectually process, but how we feel that in our gut. And in my gut, what I was feeling, and which I said to my husband on the way home that day, was, I feel like if the agency doesn't give us our stamp of approval, that we will have to turn in our firstborn child and I'll have to give up my social work degree. So that stamp of approval, that somewhere, we wear it somewhere in our psyche, that we are supposed to be super parents. We are supposed to do an extra special job. We're not supposed to ever complain about our children. We're not supposed to ask for help, because some social worker somewhere is going to say, see, I knew I shouldn't have given them a child. See, they really can't live up to that. Or if we want to go back and adopt a second time, that perhaps if we don't appear grateful enough and we're not good enough parents, that maybe we won't reach our goal a second time. And now in terms of open adoptions, there's certainly the feeling that if the birth family won't choose us, and we're not always sure why a birth family would choose us, and I hear this from adoptive parents all the time. Well, what am I supposed to wear? They'll say to me, I'm going to meet a birth family today. What do I wear? What am I supposed to look like? Should I get a wig if I'm bald? Should I dye my hair if I'm gray? Do I paint my nails red or leave my nails not red? I mean, what am I supposed to do to get a birth parent to think that I'm going to be good enough to raise their family member? And there were times when I would be disciplining my children where I actually would stop and wonder what that birth parent up in heaven, what was Diana thinking? Was she looking at me? Would she have approved at the fact that I just lost my temper with these children? Was a streak of lightning going to come down and strike me dead for not being a good enough parent to her children? And many adoptive parents actually wonder if they're supposed to be parents at all, whether God knew something about them that they themselves haven't recognized. Maybe they weren't supposed to have kids, and maybe God knew that. And so maybe they tricked society in some way. They've tricked the social worker or tricked the birth family into giving them a child. So there's tremendous feelings of self-doubt that infertility can create, tremendous feelings of loss of control. We often lose our family support as well. Often our families are not sure how to relate to our children by adoption. And if we step further outside and we adopt older children or children of other races, then we often do lose family members and friends who no longer feel comfortable with what our family has become. So those are pieces of loss. Again, we lose joyous pregnancies, we lose all of the kinds of things that go on during a pregnancy, an opportunity to be at the birth of our children. We may lose crucial information about our children or where our children have been or who's parented our children. If you bring home older children, I actually have had children look at me and say, "Where were you when I was being abused? Why weren't you there to take me sooner? Why weren't you there to stop this pain?" So that, children in their magical thinking often expect that you, if you love them as a parent, would have come in there a little sooner. So there are all of those kinds of issues of loss that continue to impact us. Certainly the years of medical treatments, the invasive tests on one's body, the going to sleep with the basal thermometer, having sex at a certain particular time because your temperature is right, robs us of a lot of the free and easy experiences of our sexuality as a husband and wife. And for many adoptive parents, that's never recovered. And there is a tremendous loss of intimacy within the family unit because of that. We live with great fears of rejection, first by social workers, then by birth families, and ultimately by our children. And part of that is an identity issue for us in the sense of not really knowing whether we're really parents or not to our children. And many times when I would look at our children and they were having difficulties, we weren't sure, my husband and I, whether they were having difficulties because we weren't good enough parents or whether they would have been having difficulties in any family. Was it something about them or was it something about us? Or if our kids are extremely successful, and we have some of those as well, again, did we have anything to do with that, really? Is it because we were exceptionally good and supportive parents, or would they have been that way in any family? So that whole issue of nature and nurture impacts us in a sense of how real are we? Are we the real parents? And again, that gets played out in society a lot when people will ask us the questions about what will you do when your children want to find their real parents? Or don't you worry if you have an open relationship with the birth family, aren't you worried that they'll love their real family more than they love you? So there's all those identity issues that also impact our role as parenting people. There's certainly a sense of shame about infertility. It's not the kind of thing that you get up on the rooftop and scream about. Hey, guess what? I'm infertile. Isn't that great? And that's that relates to a lot of personal stuff, bedroom kinds of stuff. Again, that creates another loss for us. I think one of the hardest parts about all these losses, and I could probably list hundreds of them for you over the years, is the sense of not having a way to grieve our unborn children, to grieve the loss of those roles. There's no permission in society to do that grief work. You have a child, what are you sad about? There are no rituals to catapult us into that grief process. Although I'm finding that adoptive parents around the country are looking for rituals, creating rituals. We had a family in California who literally picked a favorite spot that they went to and dug a little grave and put some things in it and planted some wildflowers and have gone back and kept that particular area well watered and beautiful. And that's kind of their place that they can go in a way to honor their unborn children. I had another family tell me recently that they took a shoebox and put in it all kinds of fantasies and dreams about what their children by birth might have been like, including pictures of themselves as children, because their assumption was that a child would have been like them in some of those ways too, physically, characteristically. Put those in a shoebox and buried it and put a little tombstone there with names on it that they would have given the children that they had not birthed. And that was helpful to them. It was helpful for them to say goodbye to those children. But in many ways, we don't have that opportunity to let go of those fantasies and dreams. We've seen clinically some real strong impact on adoptive families if the adoptive parents have not done some of this grief work before they brought a child home by adoption. So if we look at the typical stages of grief, if we look at an adoptive couple, for instance, who bring a child home and they're in that real early time of grief, perhaps the doctor has just said, well, you know, you've just spent several months or years attempting to get pregnant, it's time now for you to go out and adopt a child. And the family will often go right from the doctor's office to an adoption agency or to an attorney and say, okay, well, we're not going to be able to have our own kids, but we'd like to have a child, so tell us where to sign up. And those are often families who will want children right from birth, who look as much like them as possible. The less information they have about the birth family, the better. They certainly don't want an open adoption. Many of those families, by the way, are the same ones who will adopt internationally, thinking that they'll never have to deal with the birth family. And we have some real interesting things happening with families that are going down to Brazil, where there are light-skinned children for adoption, where they can pretend that there's just no birth family around, but yet the child is very much like them physically. And so we can actually feed into this. And I think that's what a lot of what I call fertilization adoptions are creating. Donor insemination, surrogacy, embryo transplants, those kinds of things also feed into some of this denial. And many times these are families who will say to you, I don't understand what the big hullabaloo is. I don't need any education on adoption. I don't want to join any adoption parent support groups. You just get a child early enough and you love them, and there probably isn't any reason to even have to tell them that they're adopted. Now, these are families that are based on a great deal of secrecy and fear. These are families who can become very overprotective of their children. They place all of their fears about parenthood into what I call the adoption basket, and they label it birth family. And anybody who, as I said, I had a call from a family not long ago who told me that they thought they ought to move because there was a birth parent stalking them. And I said, what do you mean? Well, we were at the mall and this blonde, blue-eyed lady who kind of looks like our child kept staring at our baby, and we just know it was the birth mother, and she's probably going to come and steal him, and we're going to move. So we're talking about real fear-based families that are going to have a great deal of difficulty discussing adoption with their children, who are going to be very overprotective. We're going to see a real dysfunctional family unit set up here. These are children who are given no permission to talk about their adoption experience or to ask any questions at all. If a family adopts in that anger phase of grief work, the why me phase, why is this happening to me? First of all, often what has happened with those families is that they've had a real breach of faith. Many of them have disconnected from any kind of religious platform that gave them sustenance because they're angry at God. And so they come into this with their teeth clenched and their fists clenched, and they're very angry at social workers and birth parents. Why do you all have to do this to me? Just give me a kid. And these are families that often end up with attachment disorders, because when they bring their child home, the anger doesn't go away. They expected it to cure their infertility. And when it didn't, what you often see are families who don't ever really bond to their child by adoption. And we've talked a lot in the clinical area for the last few years about unbonded adoptees. But I think what that's really about are unbonded parents who've been greatly impacted by their lack of grief work and then adopted prematurely. There's another phase of grief work that we call bargaining, the maybe phase. Maybe if I go to a different doctor, maybe if I switch sides of the bed, maybe if I go on vacation, maybe if I get more religious, all of those things. But probably the thing that they hear most as adoptive parents is maybe if you adopt, you'll get pregnant. And adoptive parents, prospective adoptive parents, hear that all the time. But Resolve International says that less than 5% of the people who adopt get pregnant. So the odds are very much against adoptive parents. But the child becomes the bargain. And I tell a story about a family who called in with a 16-year-old young man who they said was having a great deal of problems. And, you know, people say, fix him. The therapists in the audience, I'm sure, hear that. We want you to fix our kid. So they came in for an intake interview. They are spelling out these horrendous behaviors, and I'm listening to this thinking I would have given my right arm for a child like this. And this child got very angry and stood up and said, "Mom, Dad, I could be getting straight A's, I could be captain of the football team, I could walk on water, and it wouldn't be enough for you. I've never been enough for you." And left the room in a great deal of pain. As we examined the point at which this family adopted and what their belief was, they really did believe that he was going to get them pregnant. And there wasn't anything he could do that would be good enough. That's a real catch-22. It often gets played out, particularly with female adolescent adoptees, with early pregnancy and turning your baby over to your adoptive parents. It becomes a ticket out of the family. This is not a spelled out deal, but it's certainly an underground felt deal. And then there's depression, which is certainly a part of grief work. We all know that. And I find that adoptive parents are always depressed. It comes and goes. They learn to manage it. They manage to get into bed occasionally and suck their thumb and welcome it, and then hopefully it goes away again. Certainly if they adopt at a point where they're so into their depression, they may have some difficulty bonding to a child, making space for a child. But I think that most adoptive parents bring children home with a happy, sad experience. Happy to have a child, sad they didn't make that child. And then when they have to discuss adoption with the child, the happy, sad comes up again. And then when they have to talk about birth control, and they're still stuck on their infertility, it comes up again. Adoptive parents are notoriously poor sex educators. And it comes up again when your kids emancipate. If you waited 8, 10, 12 years for them to come home, they seem to leave awfully fast. And it comes up again when you see your grandchildren and they still don't look like you. And one of my colleagues, one of my partners actually at Parenting Resources, who's an adoptive parent, just had her daughter by adoption give birth. And she was really talking about her sadness, happy to be a grandmother, but recognizing again that she would never know what a pregnancy felt like. She'd never know what it was like to nurse a child. And watching her daughter do that brought both gladness and sadness simultaneously. A few years back when I had a hysterectomy, and I have to tell you, after 12 kids, I didn't want any more children. So it wasn't about wanting children, but it was about finally laying to rest any hope about having children. And there's a lot of paradoxes in adoptions, a lot of things that exist side by side for all of us. And it was one of those moments where I was deeply catapulted into depression again. Many women feel depressed after hysterectomy. But I think it holds, for me, it's the difference between black and white television and Technicolor. It holds a stronger sense of feel to it. It lays to rest a very important part of your life forever that you never really had a chance to complete. The issues are certainly intergenerational in adoptive families. They go on. For many families that I see out in the community, they're referred to as the infertile couple, or the couple that had to adopt in the family. They're never quite sure how their kids fit in the family. They're never quite sure when the wills are written how their kids will or will not be acknowledged. So there's an ongoing sense of this for the family. I think that loss of control that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation also plays itself out in the adoptive family, because the loss of control often pushes adoptive parents to be very controlling. And they often tend to, as I said, overprotect or expect of themselves and their children a great deal. Almost as if my kids don't look right, I won't look right. It'll be proven that I shouldn't have been a parent. So there's a lot of that kind of tension in the adoptive family that we have to look at as clinicians. Our bonds to our kids feel a little fuzzier. So when we come in for family therapy, if people don't acknowledge the form of family building, if they assume that since we came together with our kids when they were babies that we ought to be acting like other families, then they're making a big assumption that may not work for us. We really have to look at how strong those connections are and what our beliefs are about our positions and roles as parents. I think it's real important that you understand the impact of these losses on the adoptive couple and therefore its impact on the children they're raising, on the tenuousness often of their marriage after the infertility blow. And one of the things that I think adoptive parents need to hear often is you are the parents. Your kids need you to be the parents. Your kids need to know who's in charge. But they don't have to be mirrors of you. They can be who they are and still be connected to you. That this is very much more like a marriage, and I'm often saying this to adoptive parents. In many ways, you've married this child into your family. They have a whole other family attached to them. They're not blood kin, but they are connected to you, and you've made a lifetime commitment to them. And one of the ways that I often frame parenting for adoptive parents comes from a therapist by the name of Claudia Jewett here on the East Coast. Many of you may have read her works on helping children cope with separation and loss and adopting the older child, and she herself is a parent of many special needs adoptees. And one of the things that she says, which I think was very relevant here, is that all of us have to think of ourselves as parents whose hands are tied behind their back and tape is over their mouth. And spread in front of us is an invisible smorgasbord of all of who we are. And maybe that's a quart of humor, and maybe that's 2 quarts of good in math and 1 pinch of good in English. But whatever it is, maybe it's 3 gallons of hurt about infertility, but whatever it is, it's who we are. And that what being good parents is about is leaving our table spread and letting our kids take what they need and not judging that. And if we can just be available to our children and love them and let them be who they are, we've done a good job as parents. That's something that takes a lot of work for adoptive parents. It's something we have to work on all the time. Their parenting connection and the reason that their kids need them to be parents, and understanding how out of control their life experience has been, can go a long way towards really supporting the adoptive couple in being better parents to their children. Thanks.
This is sort of a workshop, so if you have any questions on what I'm saying, please interrupt. I don't necessarily just have to go on like this. I suppose I speak from 2 different positions, and neither one of them are terribly comfortable for me. One of them is easier, I suppose. That's the psychiatrist, but I don't have a lot to offer from that position. I haven't really had a lot of contact working with adoptees. I work in a clinic. There are some adoptees that come through there, and every time they do, I grab them and ask them a bunch of questions and that sort of thing. But these are not people that are getting involved in psychotherapy, and I think you learn a lot more working over time with somebody than you do just sort of doing questionnaires. And, like I say, I grab everybody I can, but that's different. Now, I've worked with adoptive parents, but they really came in for reasons that didn't have to do with adoption. I've seen some of those over long term, but that doesn't help much. And when I first came here, we've done this discussion twice now. I kind of thought, well, from a psychiatric point of view too, somebody could bring someone in here that's just an expert, on human development or psychotherapy, and that I wouldn't quite fit into that category. But now being here, I also kind of think that I'm not sure that would be that helpful here. I think that really I've known some pretty good psychiatrists, and they didn't know much about adoption, and it really wouldn't help much in this area if they don't. The other position, that of the adoptee, is much trickier, and when I first wrote this out, I kind of thought, well, my problem from this is that adoptees tend to have problems, and I'm part of that group, and I share some of these problems, so it's hard to discuss it. But it's more than that. Like I said, we gave the talk yesterday, and I had a reaction afterwards that adoption was such a secret thing for me. I mean, it was just, nobody knew about it, and in fact, it was even more secret than that in a sense. I wasn't even adopted for a long period of time. Nobody knew even about that. And so here I am in the city that ostensibly I was born in, Chicago, and I'm talking about all this kind of stuff. My parents would die if they knew this. So that there's a hesitancy about that. And then I think there's something more than that. I think there is something that I really want to talk about this in a sense. And there's things I feel I have to say. And I'll try and get into that later. It's a big issue for me, and I would hope that I can be able to discuss it somewhat. I think that sometimes there's a conflict on that. I know with my parents, and I'll get to the point where it sort of illustrates that. that to be spontaneous, to do something that really matters to you, sometimes really conflicted with them. And so you don't do it. You just don't do that. And there's a certain hesitancy. It's like, I know this is something I want to do. I know I want to tell you these things. And there's a part of me that feels like you really ought to not do it. So from the point of view of the adoptee, I think that's sort of a problem here. These positions aren't entirely independent. I don't think I can say something as an adoptee without that being infused by being a psychiatrist. In the search groups I'm in, I know that being a psychiatrist colors my views on those things. And it, by and large, sets me apart from the other people in the group. I'm from St. Louis. There's two groups. There's a Cub group and an Alma group down there. And most of the time, my position, I see things differently, like the therapeutic value of search, what can be expected in post-reunion relationships, and I'm about the only one that sees it differently. I'm much more guarded on those, to tell you the truth. I think there is a big value to searching, but I don't see it in the way a lot of other people see it. And so I think that influences. Most of the people in my search groups are less guarded, more optimistic on those things. And I suppose being an adoptee colors what I do as a psychiatrist too. Probably has something to do with the fact that I went into the field. There are three things that I want to talk about today. One of them is, how does one know if the adoption is important in the life of an individual adoptee? There's a lot of adoptees that say it's no big deal, so maybe they're right. How do you determine that? The other is, if there is something that's lost in moving from natural to adoptive, what is it? I work with people, and they know I'm interested in adoption now, and they basically say, hey, they didn't think there was anything to it. Take a child out of one family, put it in another, so what's lost should be a gain. And I don't think it's going to be news to people in here that there are things that are lost, but I think it's not real clear what it is. In a sense, you have a family, so what's the problem? What are you losing? And you're losing things somewhere in there, I think. And then finally, what happens if these losses are not dealt with? The first of these things might seem like it's not an issue. How do you know if the adoption's important in the life of the adoptee? And if you want to know that, just ask them. That sounds simple enough, and they'll tell you. And I'm going to talk now about a personal example. This is where I'm saying I'm speaking more from the point of view of the adoptee. And I think it might illustrate why that doesn't always work. I found out at the age of 12 that I was not the Andersons' natural child. And this caused a rather marked emotional reaction in me that lasted for about 2 or 3 seconds. I thought, hey, I don't like this, and I somehow don't belong in this place, and I want to be out of here. But that didn't last very long. And it was about that period of time before I realized this ought to not be a big deal. Your mother's going to be upset if you say or do anything that indicates this is important, so squelch it. So this was, you'd think, a fairly big subject. I mean, I'm in this family for 12 years. Nothing's known about this. The issue comes up. I find out I'm not their child. I wasn't even adopted, although I didn't know that. I had been with them from the time I was little. But the discussion lasted about 2 minutes, and I remember asking maybe 1 or 2 questions, and that was it. And my mode, as I remember it, was sort of like, okay. In fact, I even sort of lost contact with the fact that it bothered me. I just sort of felt like, well, just say that it doesn't matter much, So the conversation lasted about 2 minutes. I told my best friend about it, but I think I pretty well said it in a matter-of-fact way, like, hey, I'm adopted, and it didn't lead to any discussion. And other than that, and episodes that would come up with my adoptive parents and myself, about once or twice a decade, something would come up. I didn't think about, essentially, or talk about the adoption for 30 years. And obviously, if you'd asked me in that period of time whether I thought the adoption was important, I'd have said, no, I don't think it is. It was about 30 years later that I started wondering whether, gee, I wonder if adoption matters in my life. Was it an issue? Psychiatrists are always trying to figure out people and themselves, and you'd think that I would have thought about that before, but it was about that period of time. And it was around and then that my adoptive mother died, and it was after that that I started thinking about the adoption more and more and more. It wasn't that she just died and immediately I started thinking about the adoption all the time, but progressively, probably over a period of 1 or 2 years after her death, I started thinking about it more and more, to the point where today it's something that comes up every day. I don't force that. I don't get up and say, gee, let's spend your hour thinking about the adoption now. But it'll come up a lot. It comes up every day, and I sort of see it as a part of my identity. There are other people that had a conversation last night, and they don't see it that way. These other adoptees, they feel the adoption was part of their identity and has sort of faded away. Yeah.
Question, Bob. I'm not a clinician, but I mean, you said something that struck me after your adopted mother died. Looking at it, was it a question of that therefore gave you the permission to do it without asking, or was it a natural evolution? You know, from her death, looking for.
I didn't get something happened immediately after my mother's death, and this gets into, we have to talk psychiatry or psychodynamics in a sense. There were immediate changes, but not directly adoption related. It didn't go, my mother dies and immediately I think about my birth mother. It didn't go that way at all. There were changes in relationships immediately after that, and that sort of evolved into something else. So yeah, I'm sure that there's a relationship. I'm sure her dying, in a sense, the major reason that I couldn't think about the adoption was her. So the fact that it would come up afterwards had to do with her. I couldn't hurt her anymore, in a sense, okay? But it took about 2 years for that to happen. It wasn't suddenly, oh, I'm free, you know. It was something that progressively sort of happened. Yeah. It isn't quite true that in those period of time that I didn't think about the adoption. I thought about the adoption, but I didn't think about it like we think about things. You know, supposing we're going to take a summer vacation, you think about it consciously, okay? I never did that. I couldn't allow myself to consciously think about the adoption. If I did that, that implied the adoption mattered. And that would possibly be threatening to my mother. So I didn't do that. But I think the ideas were there. I look back on it now, and it's sort of interesting because at the time I didn't think it was an issue. I look back on it now and I say, well, what was adoption related and what wasn't, you know? And I had the idea that my natural parents gave me up because they were jet set people and I would have been boring and you know, I'd have been in the way. But I didn't think about that and sit down and say, gee, I wonder why they gave me up. The ideas came into my head. So I look back on it now, yeah.
You're talking about when the mother died. Was adopted father still alive?
Yes.
How come were you concerned about, you felt freer to start thinking about your other mother?
Yes.
What about his feelings?
He didn't much care, in a sense. He had a real unpleasant attitude. He was a decent person. Handled the adoption, I think, as badly as anybody could handle it. But in a sense, he didn't much care. He wasn't the one that was hurt by it. He wasn't the one that was infertile. He wasn't the one that wanted the child in the first place. So she's the one that would have been upset. She's the one that really kind of felt that if my son didn't care, it would have hurt her. My father wouldn't have much cared. Okay, so that bothered me. And these things don't go away. They don't just it's still there in a sense. But in relation to him, it was much less than it was in relation to her.
And then when you thought about this, do you think about your birth father or only your birth mother?
I only think about my birth mother. Now, that isn't exactly true, but it's mother first. Mother first, and it's the father's an afterthought. It's birth mother. Yeah.
Do you think about the reason why you didn't touch the subject or not really think about it for a long period of time is because you were fearing, like subconsciously or unconsciously, you were fearing a second rejection? Because myself, I went through therapy and I was told that the reason why I was Miss Goody Two Shoes and I liked to get a social life and that sort of thing is because in my mind, in the back of my mind, I was fearing if I'm a bad girl, well, these parents, there's a possibility that my adoptive parents could kick me out of the house. Do you believe in that?
That isn't central for me. The question you ask impinges, I suppose, on what probably is the most significant thing in my whole life, has been. And I don't know quite how to get into it in a sense. I was put into this family because Ann Anderson had a hysterectomy. I think she was 22 when she had it. She was upset about having had the hysterectomy. This was in 1939, so there were a lot of things that went with it at the time. She was upset about all sorts of other things and thinking about suicide. And I'm pretty sure I was brought into the family because this was a person that was thinking about killing herself if she didn't get a child. And if you want my opinion, how it worked was that if I were to upset her by saying, gee, I wonder about my real mother or something like that, it's hard for me to avoid the idea. And it isn't cast in terms of, oh, my mother will commit suicide. But it sort of goes into an abstract form that I will do something like that and something really bad's going to happen and I'll be responsible for it. I'll jump ahead. There was an interchange that's bizarre, but I'll try and include it now. I was talking to an aunt. My adoptive mother was about to die. She had cancer. There was no doubt that she was going to die. And my aunt and I are having a conversation, and it's about genetics, and it's about the family. She really was trying to be kind, and she said, "Aren't you glad you're not a member of the family?" And I said, this gets really bizarre. I said, "Well, yeah, but in some ways I don't feel like a member of the family, huh? Doesn't that follow from what you just said?" And she said, "Why? I don't understand that. Your mother loved you your parents loved you very much." And at that point, I felt, wow, here's my mother. She is sick and dying, okay? And I tell my aunt that I didn't feel like a member of the family. And I felt, this is hard to convey how big of a deal this was for me. I thought, if Aunt Shirley tells my mother that I didn't feel like a member of the family, my mother's going to be so hurt, and she's going to die, and I'm going to be responsible. And that's what I think was the dynamic for me.
And how old were you when you felt that?
That wasn't all that long ago, about 8 years. Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle. I'm adopted, and I have 2 natural siblings, top and bottom. And my parents as well don't know. They can't believe that. You know, when I tell them, "Listen, I'm different. You know, I'm adopted." They're not. They can't believe that I can say that. You know, like I can really relate to what you're saying. That how come you don't feel part of the family? That's not what I'm saying here. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's strange because she just said it. I mean, the logic just follows along. Aren't you? You're not a member of the family? I don't feel like a member of the family? Why?
No wonder you're not schizophrenic after that.
Yeah, it's strange.
Double speak.
Really? I said so. Please, not schizophrenic. I mean, it's not.
I was talking about identity, and that it's a big part of my identity, and other adoptees that have searched and say it isn't. So, you know, maybe people different on that, but it's a big part of it. So if somebody asked me now if the adoption's important, I'd say, yeah, I can't think of a whole lot in my life that isn't, you know, that's in a sense bigger than that. So the point to that is I don't think you can just ask the adoptee whether the adoption's important and take that at face value. I think the adoptee can be defended against knowing that, and I think I'm an example of that.
Can you break that down a little further between male and female?
Well, I can tell you what happens in search groups. Search groups, women outnumber the men about 4 or 5 to 1, and I think women are much more likely to know that it matters to them. I make the assumption it matters to everybody. I could be wrong. Maybe there's some people it doesn't matter to at all. I think it does to everybody, and I think women are much more likely to know that. In our search groups, it's almost all women.
Why?
I don't know. You start thinking about it, you're going to start crying, for one thing, and men aren't supposed to do that. So, you know, women can do that a little easier. Women talk about this with their friends. Guys don't do that, and this is my best. We were close friends. We played football. We played catch. We did stuff like that. We didn't sit around and talk about interpersonal relationships. So I guess it's just the way guys and girls are brought up.
Is it their denial in people that say, I'm just asking, people that say, well, it's not part of my identity, you know, like adoption doesn't really matter for me. Are they denying? I mean, I think it's bullshit, you know. I think everybody that's adopted, every adoptee, it matters. You know, even though it doesn't surface inside, you know, it kind of controls.
Well, that's my view on it, but I don't, you know, therapeutically I don't know where you go with that. In a sense, therapeutically what you do, I think, is you make the assumption it matters, okay? And you make an intervention based on that. You look for reasons to make connections. If it doesn't fly, you don't just keep hammering it away on it. You file it away and assume it's important somehow and look for another chance to bring it up. It's my view that it matters to everybody. I can't imagine how it doesn't. This is your family. I mean, you can describe this in a lot of different ways. One way to say it is you lost your family. You know, why wouldn't that matter? I mean, you can say that in a lot of different ways and obviously matter. But in a sense, if you got somebody that says it doesn't matter and they don't do anything that's consistent with it mattering, does it matter? It's kind of like a tree falls in the forest and it doesn't, does it make a sound? I don't know. You know, I don't know. I think it matters. I think it matters to other people.
Excuse me, do you think it made a difference that the thing at the age of 12, when you're just coming into adolescence and you're going through all these who am I identity things anyway, and here you are at 12 and they tell you, oh, by the way, you're not really ours?
If I do so, I don't read as much as I should on the subject of adoption. And some of the stuff I read, I think, oh, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I think what they do is they take concepts that are basically concepts, you know, and they apply them to adoptees. So I don't know if the timing makes that much difference in a sense. You know, I think it was a real big issue because it's a real big issue. But if they said it in adolescence, you know, and say, well, is that a bad time? Would you have been better off doing it earlier or later? I don't really know. In a sense, I kind of think you're better off knowing, you know, whenever you can find out. But I don't think it was crucial that it came in at that time. You know, there was another feeling. I always had a feeling. I mean, you can't hide this sort of stuff. I didn't know I was adopted, but I always felt I was different. I mean, you always felt set apart. I cast it as though, well, I'm an only child, and everybody around me is not an only child, and so they're different because they're not only children. So it was total news to me that I was adopted. I didn't expect that and I found out how I happened to ask the question. It was pretty cut and dried. I learned about the hysterectomy. I knew when I was born, and I thought, we got a problem here, you know. But it's funny because in a sense, I expected there'd be an answer to it, and it's sort of funny. I expected, she lied about when the hysterectomy was. I think the hysterectomy was 2 years earlier, in fact. They lied about everything on this. I think she said the hysterectomy was at a different time, so as I got it, it was at a time when she could have started with a uterus, okay, and then lost it in the process. And I kind of thought, well, I was only 12, and I thought maybe there's a way to biologically explain this. And I don't know, maybe somebody knows this. Can you carry an ectopic pregnancy to term? No, you can't do it? I thought you could. I'll have to change something. I thought you could. But I asked, and I expected that the answer would be, oh, there's some biological explanation. And I can feel the feeling now. I know the room. I remember where it was. I was shocked. I just thought, God, this is unreal. And it's still, you know, it's still unreal. I mean, I talked yesterday, and I think, can this be real? I mean, am I not really just sort of an Anderson in this little starchy world? And I think all this stuff is true. I was black market. I was not adopted. You know, it's a mess from that point of view. And I think, is this my life? And it's kind of like I'll go through a lot of my life and think it's not, and to come to a conference like this and I say it, I think, guess it's real, you know. We're really talking about loss in this, I guess, and I think it's not easy to clarify what's lost. I mean, from one point of view you can describe it, but it doesn't do it. Something seems to be lost. I think most of you probably know the statistics. The adoptees are overrepresented in the mental health field. I have a friend that works at the Devereux Clinic in Atlanta. She's been there 3 or 4 years. This number is going to be high, but it's not as high as other numbers. In the adolescent inpatient psychiatric unit at that place, adoptees are 40% of the admissions. Okay. Across the country, there are reports from other institutions where it's twice that, 80%. Now, you're not going to get that number across the board. Okay. There was somebody that did a study in St. Louis, and it was 5 times higher or something like that. It varies with socioeconomic groups, and it varies with clinics, and it varies with age groups. It's not as many in adults and all that sort of stuff. We're not looking at schizophrenia. We're not looking at manic depressive disease any more than the general population. We're looking at behavioral disorders. We're getting a lot of that in adolescence. Depression, diffuse problems, identity, self-esteem, maybe alcoholism. But I think the number that's probably valid is that amongst adolescents, they constitute perhaps 20 or 25% of the patients that are going to mental health professionals. So there's a problem, you know, something seems to be lost in there. Doesn't seem to be, you can say on the one hand what it is that you lose, and it makes sense to me. I will get moved by this, but I don't think a lot of people would. If you say you lose your family, you know, a lot of people will say, well, you got another family, and you maybe got a better one, and you know, you never knew the family. So that doesn't carry a lot of weight, although there are people in this room that will understand what that means. I might jump ahead. You don't lose, obviously you don't lose physical things in a sense. You know, I got the same amount of Christmas presents. But even with that, I have to say this, that yeah, I got Christmas, but you get the same things. When I was in the 6th grade, my best friend is a guy who went on to play. I'm from California, and I come from the era when Bill Russell and Casey Jones were there at USF. Okay, that was a big place to go. So Bob went to USF, had a basketball scholarship at USF, became a Catholic All-American at USF. My other friend that I played basketball with went to Stanford. He was the 6th man on the Stanford team. I played some college basketball, but that's stretching credibility a little bit. But these were the guys I played basketball with, you know, and in 6th grade, so we were pretty good. We could take on the teachers and beat the teachers. And my parents got me a basketball, terrific, okay, but the basketball, I could never use it. It was a beach ball kind of basketball. And we would go out there and I'd bounce with the thing and I'd think, I don't like this basketball, and I never used it. And all I did with that present was to feel bad that I unappreciative.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me that I can't appreciate this? It was totally inappropriate for the quality of ball we were playing, And so in a sense, yeah, I got presents, but there wasn't much empathy there and connecting with the kind of things. My son plays baseball. I had a baseball scholarship to the University of California, and that's stretching things too. That's literally true, but I didn't have a great career. But I can pick out a bat for my son, and there's no doubt about, I get the bat exactly the one he wants. I don't have any question that I can get in and know exactly what he wants, what he needs. We throw the same. We have the same kind of issues. We do this so much that there's a lot of empathy. That wasn't there. So you get the physical things, but I guess in a way you have to question whether, I got a basketball, terrific. I never used it. It was a problem. It was an emotional problem that I received, in a sense.
So, are you saying then that there's a connectedness in the natural family where you seem to have more ability in making that connectedness with your son than your parents did with you?
Biologically, I think that's really true. My father was not athletic. I was interested in that. We played catch for 10 minutes. We didn't have much in common there, and really that was sort of funny. We played catch for 10 minutes. I wasn't very old when we did it, and I realized this isn't really going to work very well because the guy doesn't throw very well, okay? So that not having those kind of things in common, if you share those things in common, my son does that sort of stuff, and it's easy to empathize. If he was doing something else, it would be harder for me to relate to him on those things. I mean, I can get mad at him when he takes a pitch down the middle and doesn't swing at it because he's doing some particular kind of thing, and I know exactly what he feels, okay? And if he was doing something like playing the violin, I'd probably go to his concerts and stuff, but I couldn't get in it. I couldn't relate to it in the same kind of way. And as you move away from natural to adoptive, you start getting further and further away. You start rolling the dice as to whether you're going to have that in common. And if you've got it in common, you have a closer relationship. I hang around with people that do the kind of things I do. I don't go around with people that do things that I don't. That's just human nature, isn't it? Yeah. In search groups, I'm in 2 of them, and there's exceptions. So I think you brought up an exception. Generally, you find people that if they're musically oriented, they find musically oriented birth parents. If they're athletically oriented, you find athletically oriented birth parents. If you find mechanically oriented, we had a guy that was a mechanic. His father was a mechanic. And a lot of those things seem to be biological. The problems that what you lose if you don't define it in a general sense like family, you lose things that are kind of abstract, they're diffuse, they're emotional kinds of things. It's empathy in a sense, you don't get the right basketball, you get a basketball, but it doesn't fit. And they're hard to define, and they cause diffuse problems, I think. Adoptees have problems with identity, that's kind of diffuse, isn't it? You have problems with self-esteem, that's diffuse. You have problems with interpersonal relationships, that's diffuse. You don't have a problem with, vitamin B12 deficiency, that's easy to handle. You have these abstract things that are hard to define. And in a way, they're harder to deal with because you don't even know what it is. I think Sharon said something like that, addressing the fact, well, you've got a child, what's the problem? In a sense, you've got a family, so what's the problem? But it's a family that's not in tune with you in a lot of ways. And you lose things like being in tune. I think there is something that could be, if we start talking about losses, there's something that every adoptee has, and has to do with their mother giving them away. And I don't know what you call it. One way to say it is there's sort of a loss of innocence that goes with finding out that your mother gave you away. Mothers are up there with God and country. Mothers are caring, mothers are capable, mothers are there when nobody else is, pretty often. And for the adoptee, this wonderful person that's generally conceived in all these terms gave the child away. And that's hard to deal with, and adoptive parents will say things like, well, she loved you so much that she gave you away. I don't know about you, but I have trouble with that. I really do, and I think, that there's no way you're going to avoid as a child thinking it's you, You think it's the reason you were given up is you. No matter what is said, that's the position you're going to start from. And I think once you realize that mother, and all that entails, it's a concept almost, she didn't want to see you anymore and gave you away, and I think that it colors your world, it really does. I have a friend that when she was involved in the adoptee search group, she was the one that I identified the most with, and she said once that her world is always blue, it's always sad, it's never different, and that isn't bad, that's a way to live a life, You can build it on that kind, it's better than no feelings at all. But I think that in a sense, that once you realize that your mother gave you away, that it changes the world kind of forever in a certain way. When I was in high school, I had a good friend. In college, we went to different schools, but when we finished college, my world stayed the same, basically. I continued on in studies, played touch football on Saturday afternoons, and the big thing were exam scores and social relationships, and, you know, you went to the zoo, and it wasn't any problem. And Larry went to Vietnam, and he piloted a PT boat up and down the Mekong Delta. I suppose he shot people. I suppose he got shot at, you know. And I work with a lot of Vietnam vets, and I know that guys that went over there and got involved in that and had a tough tour duty, they don't come back and see society the same anymore. It's never the same. It's different. And I think adoptees have a similar kind of problem, maybe less, maybe more. But once you realize that your mother gave you away, you know, that never quite gets out of your head.
Combined, it's great.
It's you know, there's a thing there.
I think that's true even as an adoptee, as an adult. Every once in a while you get that feeling like, you know, how could you do that? But I think then you begin to realize in the society and you look back and how frequently women have not been supported, you know, in their quests, you know, like keeping a child. You need to keep a focus on that, I think, as an adult. And maybe it's hard to tell children.
I'm in a group of birth mothers, and I love them dearly, and they always keep saying, but we didn't have any choice, we didn't have any choice. There's a lot of birth mothers in here, you probably, a lot of them feel the same kind of way. And I can understand it, I really do, and I can understand that in the same situation, I probably would do the same thing. But as an adoptee, that child in you sort of says, but how could you do it? You know, it doesn't hit that.
Right.
It doesn't get into that part.
So then does that translate into anger? Are you really angry at her and have what is rage?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm not, that isn't foreign to me. Because when you think about me, when I think about my birth mother, it's sort of with a mixed bunch of things. I think by and large, somebody said something yesterday that was really touching in here. It'll sound funny, but it really was touching. And I might have missed something on it. There was an adoptee that was looking for her mother, and her mother died just before she got there. And they had just put her in the ground. Okay? I don't remember if there was another family there or not. And the adoptee paid $1,000 to have the body interred. Okay? I guess so that she could see the mother, and so that she could put a rose in the casket. You know, and I thought, yeah, that's kind of the way you feel, by and large. You know, there's a connection there that matters. And I'll feel all of those things, you know, but anger wouldn't be the leading thing.
As far as anger, I find for myself that I'm an adoptee, that I have rage, uncontrollable rage at different points in my life. Rage at when abandonment issues come up, when people leave me, when people die. I could never really understand. When people died, I really couldn't handle it. My dogs died. Amazing. You know, things that left me in my life. I found my birth mother last month, and I found her name and where she lives, and I went through some type of grieving process, but I went through a lot of rage, and I thought that I was going to go out of my mind there for a while. I don't know, it settles back down for a while, and then it comes back up again, and I really don't know where that anger comes from. Initially, like, I know that there is rage towards my birth mother for relinquishing me, for not wanting to see me. And then there's rage towards my adoptive parents because they could never really say, I love you. And they bought me things, but they could never really tell me that they love me and that they love me even though I wasn't their natural child. I used to think sometimes that my father was going to kill me or that he changed his mind because I was the bad adoptee. Thought maybe, he may have changed his mind and now he's going to return me. You know, I was an adult when I thought things like this, or I was in high school when I thought things like this. And I don't know, it's like when I wonder if other adoptees have this sort of rage that I have. It's just, sometimes it has to be worked through, I know that.
We had a group in our Alma group that sort of the motif of the group is to somehow suppress the idea that there's anger, and that always bothered me because I think there's both, you know, and I think if somebody doesn't feel angry about this, they're missing something. But by the same token, there's the other set of feeling too about putting the rose in the casket. I mean, there is a certain, this is your mother in a way, and that somehow doesn't change. So I think there's both of those things. Yeah.
I think there's both, on both sides, what you talk about the adoptee feeling somehow flawed because given away. I think birth mothers or at least for myself, feel, well, okay, I can make a strong argument for not really having any other choice, but I also feel deep inside that there's something unnatural and something wrong with me because I gave up this child.
Yeah.
I was writing down something that I've heard a long time ago, repeatedly, she couldn't keep me. I've always accepted that as fact, and I just wrote down after that, why the hell couldn't she?
I think there's a pretty decent answer to that, and because I hear all the birth mothers talking about it, and I think, yeah, I can understand their position. She was a part of a family, and probably a more accurate way to say it is that the greater family would not keep you, because generally you've got a young girl that if her parents, if somebody would have been supportive, she would have kept you, but the family in a sense said no, so that you have a family that didn't do it, uncles, aunts, grandparents, parents.
As a birth mother, I think we go through a lot of anger too. It's not, I've gone through anger with my family for the same reasons. There was no support. If I had had some support, at one point I decided to bring my daughter home from the hospital, or from her foster home. And my mother and I put up the crib. I went to buy some things for the baby, and when I came home, my father had come home from work, and he came up to my room and he said, "You can't bring that baby home." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, your mother can't help taking care of you." Now, this is a manipulative mother that never did a damn thing she didn't want to do. And she never got a job because she might not be able tomorrow, and therefore she couldn't have worked. And so what happened, and I realized this at that point, was that my father came home from work, my mother went and boo-hooed to him, and because he was very passive, and maybe in his own way, he didn't want that baby home either. He came and said, "I couldn't bring it home," and I said, "Well, I've got to go back to work. Who's going to take care of the baby?" And he said, "Well, she can't help you." At that point, I knew there was no discussion. It was like, it's not coming home. A month ago, we're talking 19 and a half years later, my mother sat and looked me in the eye and had the guts to ask me, why did I change my mind after she put up the crib and after she went to get some things for that baby? I have felt such anger for her. I could have killed her. And it wasn't the fact as much that happened as if, why in the hell are you asking me this 20 years later? Number one. And number two, my dad's been dead for 15 years. Why are you bringing this up now, putting the blame on him? And that's what she was doing. Well, I guess that's what Dad did. I wanted to haul off and deck her.
Yeah.
And I haven't talked to her since. I wrote her a letter, a 3-page letter, and I told her the anger I felt for her. And I told her, I'm not blaming you, because I had a mind of my own. And maybe I didn't have enough guts to be rebellious enough or whatever to keep my child. So I'm not blaming her, and I still feel it was probably the best. But we go through anger too. I've never had another child. That was my one child. Out of 8 grandchildren that my parents had, she was the only girl. And she's gone.
I think Sharon brought it up. There's 2 sides to every issue. One is an intellectual response and one is an emotional response. I'm an adoptee. The main intellectual response is very clear that there were some really good reasons why my birth mother relinquished me. She had family pressure. She was not allowed to come home. They were to write her off and lots of stuff, and I understand that. Emotionally, like somebody else said, my gut response is still, how come she didn't keep me? So I'm battling those all the time, and I'm sure that both other members of the triad battle the same stuff, because we all have to respond both ways.
It's all true. Every one of those is true. Why couldn't she keep me, and I couldn't keep you?
And I think it's not only that the birth mother's family, for that reason of giving the child up, because her family wouldn't support her. But, then a person might think, well, why didn't she just try then on her own to make it on her own with the child? And that was a scary part for me too, because I had no support whatsoever from my family, but even on my own.
They can always,
See how I could raise a child
it's sort of,
on air when you don't have money coming in and
Yeah, it's sort of always the choice, but when you hear the stories, you realize it really wasn't the choice. And then the clincher so often is, if you really loved your child, you'd give them up. You know, and then you feel like we're going to make a mess of this anyway, we're not going to get by, and somebody's telling me if I really cared, I'd give it up. You know, and these are authorities that seem to know what they're doing, and you got nobody in your camp. What are you going to do? That's what they do.
Seen.
And we still have adoption agencies making full plans for people for adoption. Intellectual plan for, make your plan for adoption.
Yeah.
It's an intellectual function.
Yeah.
And that goes on by fairly liberated, aware social workers today that are part of the forefront of this movement.
Yeah.
They're still saying that.
It's not just
something lacks.
not just adoption agencies. I mean, it's going on with independent attorneys and
Sure. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm not even getting into that.
yeah.
But I mean, in the best of the best,
You
that the intellectualization of that relinquishment is still going on.
You bet.
I'm a birth grandmother of 3 years, and it's really tough for me because I'm not able to be angry towards anyone because I'm the witch that I guess I coerced my daughter into adoption, to relinquishing her child. At least my support group, every birth mother beats on me. Not that that's what they're doing, but that's how I feel. Because I'm hearing over and over their anger towards their mother.
Right.
I don't have anybody to be angry towards. And I know I said to my daughter the other day, I said, I'm really sorry. And she said, but Mom, nobody told us there was another option. And at that point I thought, if adoption is not the best thing, what are our options? I mean, what is another option? How is society going to help pregnant girls to keep their babies?
I think there are a million options that we don't think about, and one of the questions I always ask an audience is what would happen, and I ask this of adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents, what would happen tomorrow if there was a pill that suddenly cured all of infertility, and families that presently grow by adoption didn't need to do that anymore? Don't you think that we would shift major resources in this country overnight to help, and we'd have every investment in keeping families together. But because we hook adoption and fertility together, we have no investment to come up with those programs. There's not going to be an investment until infertility is disconnected from crisis pregnancy. You'll never be given those options as a grandmother or as a pregnant woman, because there's nothing in this society that supports that.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say to her, sometimes adoption is the best option. I'm a birth parent and an adoptive parent, but there's always going to be pain. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Right.
But see, I have no one to direct that pain to. I don't, because I feel like I am the perpetrator.
Part of the whole reason for service is that kind of reconciliation. And along with the anger and the rage as an adoptee, there was also a real thankfulness that I exist. I mean, it was a lot more painful for her than it really is for me. I have issues, but I do exist, and I'm glad I'm here, and I'm enjoying the ride. And I wouldn't have been here in any other way. And I think that's really part of what search is. In addition to identity, it's also reconciliation of that.
I was a 16-year-old birth mother who, for all the obvious reasons, being 16, gave up her child because they said, this is what you must do, and I did it. When it turned around that I became a mother of a child who was 16 who got pregnant many years later, and the options were then on the other side, I thought, oh, no way. If you're pregnant, there's no way you're going to give up this child. And I would have been just as, it turns out she wasn't pregnant, thank God, but I would have been just as wrong to make that decision for her to say, you're not going to give up that child because this isn't going to happen to me again.
Right.
Than I would have been to say that my parents say, you must do this. The decision has to be, a whole family. It is not one person's decision. It really is a family decision.
Well, if a birth mom's going to make choices, and I am a birth mom, then your alternatives need to be viable. They need to be realistic. And, you know, if the family support comes from, for helpful, for childcare while you're working, whether you need training for working. I mean, how many special work training programs are there for pregnant women, no matter how old they are, to teach you to become financially self-sufficient in 6 months? You know, do women make as much as men with the same jobs? There's a whole lot of things in society that you can do without becoming a parent yourself that would help provide viable alternatives in your community.
This society and the government, the society does not take good care of its children. I think all we have to do is look around, whatever children they are.
Even in counseling, how many people have welfare mothers come in and say, hey, it's really tough to survive on welfare, but we're doing it because we're divorced, we're single parents, you know, my husband died, something.
Right.
And it is possible to survive.
Okay, could we have one more question and get back to Bob? I'm afraid we're kind of leading him astray.
Ask
away. You know, with that, you know, transition back to Bob, sort of transition
No, go ahead.
for a minute.
Yeah.
The idea of the infertility as an issue, the self-esteem and the loss. Is there evidence, or what, does it make a difference which one of the parents was infertile? We're in the process of a search, and it's not going real well. I mean, we know there has been a meeting, that there's stonewalling from the home front. And the question is, does it make a difference if it's the man or the woman who's infertile?
It's a power issue. It's a very weighty issue in that marriage, and has a great deal of impact. The person who carries the infertility issue in the family, that self-esteem is even further impacted in that coupleness. Often the infertile person will say to the fertile partner, perhaps we ought not to be married. Perhaps I don't deserve to be with you. Perhaps you ought to leave and be with somebody else who can give you a child. So it has a great impact. It is an important issue, and it gets played out in some interesting fashions. One of them being that in some cultures, we work with a lot of Hispanic families in Southern California. Very often what I find is that the woman is carrying, even if she's not the infertile one, she carries that label in the larger family to protect her husband. So she will say, I'm infertile, rather than him having to say to his family that it's he that's not able to help produce a child. And so it gets played out even differently in terms of different cultures. And many families will say to us at our clinic that they're very glad that they have an undiagnosed infertility, that they're probably both contributing something, or they don't know that their marriage would last. So you bet it makes a big difference who's carrying the label and how they've addressed that in their marriage.
I think I read this somewhere, but I don't know it from experience with people, that the one that's infertile is the one that generally wants to adopt, the other one's a little cooler on it.
Which one would fight the reunion of their adopted child and her birth mother? I mean, if that...
Very much as Bob was saying earlier, I think that the person who's heavily loaded and not wanting that to happen is the one who's gained parenthood by way of infertility. Yeah.
Yeah, and my family would have been my father that would have fought it, my mother that would have cared, but he'd be just sort of fighting for her. She probably would have sort of gone along.
This marks the end of session number 21, tape 1. Please now turn to session 21, tape 2.
Well, you're asking a huge question, and there is a lot of information, but I wonder if maybe we could come back to that. I just feel like your presentation
No, that's fine. I'm
so
just,
valuable.
Could
we have Bob? Yeah.
And if we run over, the heck with it.
Yeah,
we got a lot of time.
That.
There's just sort of two things that we were sort of hitting on it. But let me say a couple things. I'll just sort of go on that. I think there's something lost in the nature of relationships. I don't think you can just transplant a child from one to the other. I'll tell you some statements that my parents said or my father said that sort of typifies that. I think they're kind of statements that are typical of the problems adoptees have. There's not gross mistreatment in them. But he said once, for example, that as a father, he always did more than what was required of him to do. And I think, well, it's not gross mistreatment. He met and exceeded his requirements. But I know when I heard that, I thought there's something wrong with this. You don't think of your children in terms of requirements and quotas that you have to meet. You want the best for them, you do what you can, okay? And to intersperse the idea that there's a requirement that I have to live up to, I think implies a certain distance. He also said once that I always thought of you as if you were my own son, okay? The very statement, it implies something. He also said, I better not ever find that you're looking for your real mother. Well, what does that say about how he sees him and my adoptive mother? I have the aunt that said the issue about, aren't you glad you're not a member of the family? You know, and there's no other way to take that other than she didn't see me as a member of the family. I was placed in the family early, but not adopted until I was 13. It had to do with being a black market placement. You can't get a black market baby and then go to the judge 2 years later and say, we want to adopt this child. You get real problems doing that. So they had to sit for that period of time. Discussion, this wasn't that long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. I asked him, I said, what would have happened if you would have died, you and Mother would have died prior to the time that I was adopted? And his response was, well, I guess you'd have gone back to the orphanage. You know, and I wasn't moved by that either. He had a will that was made out that had me in it. Okay, I was the only child in the family, so it went to me. But if I was dead, I have 2 children. It didn't go to my children, his grandchildren. It went to his brothers and sisters, okay? Now, all of these things, I think, are reflections of attitudes that are there. I think they speak to the unconscious attitudes these people have. It's not the same kind of relationship. If you would have asked my parents, you know, is this your son? They would have said in a group like this, whatever it is that would be appropriate to say. But they're saying all these other kind of things, so that's the message that you get through. And what do adoptees have a problem with? They have a problem with a sense of belonging. They often don't feel they belong in some area. I think it has something to do with stuff like this. It's sort of strange that I have a birth certificate that says I was born in this city. I used to come to Chicago, and this was even before I was thinking about adoption. I'd come to Chicago, and it had a magic. I'd look at the tenement buildings, and it was kind of like, you know, and I guess what was going on is, you know, could have been here, maybe my mother's here. Here's another thing that's sort of interesting. My search has been a mess. There was a period of time when I guess I was born in the continental United States, but there was no guarantee exactly where that was. And there was a time when I believed I was from Memphis. And prior to that, I thought I was from Milwaukee. Okay, Chicago was out, Milwaukee was in. And there is a magic now that's back in Milwaukee. When I hear people, there's a couple of people that are here at the conference that are from that area, and they talk about Appleton or they talk about Madison, and I just, oh, God, how great it is. And somebody sent me a tape one time from up there that was for another reason, and had the advertisements from people that are sitting in Madison. And I'd look at the advertisements, and I thought, this is great, somebody's up there. It's from there. When I thought I was in Memphis, born in Memphis, Milwaukee went just like that. Didn't matter at all. Memphis was suddenly important. And I'd watch the Liberty Bowl, and I'd see people leaving the Liberty Bowl, and they're all going home, and I was homesick. It's kind of like, you know, that's where I belong. So I used to come to Chicago, and I had that kind of a feeling that, you know, this was the place to be. It says I was born in Chicago, the birth certificate. It says I was born on April 16th, and says I was born to the Andersons. Okay, it hasn't got any of these things right. I wasn't born on the 16th, wasn't born in Chicago, wasn't born to the Andersons. From a practical point of view, I suppose it doesn't make a lot of difference, huh? I don't know what we use birth certificates for. I don't travel that much. I guess you use them to get visas to go overseas. Mine will work. Okay, it's the same as yours. It'll work. It isn't correct, but it'll work. I do find it irritating that people didn't get any of this stuff straight. What does this sort of imply? You know, whatever goes on, everybody else keep track of it, but for you, it doesn't really matter. Or in my situation, really, it was worse than that they deliberately changed all this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, from the point of view of the birth certificate, it does what it's supposed to do. I sort of bring it up. Let me say one other thing on this. That come back to the date. The date doesn't make a lot of difference in a sense, too, with certain things you're doing with it. If you're trying to measure years, we could all assign June 3rd as our birthdays, and we'll keep track of the years. We'll be off a little bit, but that'll work, okay? But my birthday was just arbitrarily assigned, and I experienced it different than other people do. I won't know it's my birthday by and large until I'm typically at work, writing scripts, trying to figure out what day it is, look on the thing and say, oh yeah, it's my birthday. I mean, the fact that it was arbitrarily assigned really changes it. Not a major issue in life, okay? I'm not about to say that birth certificates need to be changed and everybody make sure you guys sitting there with an authentic birth certificate and you won't have any problems. But think about what this says about the people that put this together. Okay, think of what it says about the relationship of the people that felt they could change all these things. I was placed apparently at 3 days in the family, something like that, very early. I was not adopted until I was 13. The Andersons then went to California, and they lied to the state about where I was from. The reason, I guess, being that the state was supposed to contact the natural parents, they'd go back and get a birth certificate, contact the parents. Legal custody for me resided with my natural parents. I was not aware of this until I just, not too long ago, a couple years ago, looked at my adoption decree, and it said we now remove legal custody from these people, and I'd never met them. That's kind of strange. But the Andersons felt that, that they don't want that to happen, so they lied to the state. I have a baptismal certificate from 2 or 3 months of age that also says I was born in Chicago. So they were lying back then about where I was from. There's a process that continued on over a long period of time. They lied to me about it. They lied to the rest of the family about it. They all kind of thought I came from Chicago. And at the least, I think you can say that in this relationship there's a certain loss of honesty, okay? I think you can say more than that. I think it really does imply that their sense of privilege about what they could do vis-a-vis me, was kind of unlimited. They could change anything they wanted. And I don't know exactly what it says, but it doesn't say something that's good. I want to come back to the name bit, too. I skipped over that. The time and place, I suppose, are tied into identity. I mean, it's funny, when I thought I came from Kentucky or Tennessee, I'm pretty messy. My house is a mess and stuff, and people from Milwaukee are real scrubby. And, everything's in order. And I felt relieved. I thought, oh God, I can explain why my yard's a mess because I'm from Kentucky. And I just sort of picture the people from Kentucky in the back hills have car parts all over the yard. I felt good about that. And I suppose it has something to do with your identity, but that's not, where you're born isn't, it has something to do with it, but it isn't central. But your name does, yeah.
I think all of us are interested in your story at this point.
Oh.
You told it very, in a very way to make us be very concerned about it. And I guess I wonder, what does your father say about these things? I mean, now you've asked him. Why don't you have the answers?
He's dead now. My mother died, and I hadn't thought about the adoption prior to that. She's the one that, in fact, had I probably asked, but that would have been, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I didn't do it, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I really would have thought that it would have killed her or something like that, a derivative of that. I mean, a physician, I can sit there and I say, well, what's the biological basis for her dying? And I guess I can write one up. But I would have felt that would have happened. So I wouldn't have asked her. Didn't bother him that much, so I did ask him. Took a while for me to get into it. First thing I asked was why wasn't I adopted until I was 13? I didn't say, where's my natural mother? I mean, I started real cautiously on this. He just lied. He lied, and he lied, and he lied, and he lied. Finally, there was one point in time, when he's lying, I don't want to get into, certain people you can tell they're lying in a sense. There was a time when he said something that I thought was true, because he said it in a different mode. Now, I don't know if it was true, because he could have been lying then, too. He started, I guess, crying. He was on the telephone, so I don't know that. And he confessed to me that the worst thing they ever did in their life, that they were good people and so forth, was that I was a black market placement. And then he told me some things on the basis of that no, I wasn't. Well, the reason I asked that is that I thought that I could find out some things independently, because he wasn't cooperating at all. So I wrote California, and I said, can you help me out in this? Did you ever have an original birth certificate? And they said, we never got one. And I was kind of mad about that. And I called my father and I said, what kind of place did I come through that didn't get a birth certificate? And the family at that point in time, I'd been talking to them. So he was getting pressure from other people to say, because basically the rest of the family kind of felt that they ought to tell me. He ought to tell me things. So I'm sure that they were saying that. And then he confessed this. That's the term to use. It wasn't telling me. And he was very upset about it. And in that time, he said some things, that I thought were accurate. But then he sort of closed up. And then any other avenues that I took to find out things from him, his sense of privilege was such that, he said things like, I don't know if it was in writing in relation to that, I better not ever find out that you're interested in finding your natural mother, your real mother. I wish I had died when your mother died. I wouldn't have to see this. We always thought well of you, and now this, this sort of ruining the memory I have of your mother. I mean, all that kind of stuff. But then he just frankly lied on everything. And then he started to get Alzheimer's disease. And it got to the point where I couldn't tell whether he's lying or he just didn't know it anymore. And I couldn't continue to badger the guy. And, you know, we just parted our ways. What happened with him and me was that he told me that it was the bit about me believing the stuff about coming from Milwaukee, and then hearing from somebody else that knew about it. Now, it turns out I think she was wrong. She said, no, you weren't. She said it so crisply. It was so refreshing to hear somebody say something honest. The first person that ever said anything honest. She said, oh, no, you were a black market baby. And it wasn't said in a bad way. You were a black market baby and you came from Kentucky or Tennessee. And when I heard that, I thought my father was even lying when he was telling me about Milwaukee. And I thought, that's it. I will not participate in this relationship anymore. I had done everything that I could do as best as I could to indicate that this mattered to me, and I would really like to know this kind of stuff. And I felt that if he's going to continue to lie in this kind of thing, and even trick me at that I'm not going to have anything to do with him anymore. And it became very perfunctory then. I did not, he was in a nursing home, and I was in terms of managing his expenses to do that, and I did that. But we didn't have very many calls, as I remember. I sure didn't go visit him anymore, and he died 2 years later. So for about 2 years, we didn't have much to do with each other.
Talk about the names before we have to stop.
We decided we'll go on if you all want to.
Oh, the names. Yeah, that you can't just. That matters. It just matters, and every adoptee in here will know it matters. And I don't think anybody can really say why it does, but it damn well does. And I know there was a period of time, and I can say this, as a psychiatrist, you pay some attention to dreams. You kind of figure that dreams are going to sort of tell it like it is, the window of the unconscious. I used to dream about finding out my name. And it was a repetitive dream that I had about finding out my name. And I'd be very, very excited in the dream that I'm going to learn my real name, And I'd be very disappointed to wake up and find out that it was just only a dream. And I have a daughter that's 17. She's known about my adoption for as long as she's been around, I guess, No, that isn't true because I guess I didn't talk. But she's known about it for most of the time. It matters. And it just hit her recently that Anderson isn't, as she put it, her real name. And she wanted to know her real name, and she used those terms, real name. So the names matter. You can't dismiss it. I assume it has to do with identity, but I don't know exactly what it is. I think in most adoptive relationships, there was a girl yesterday that said something that was funny. She was talking about honesty, and she said, my parents were honest. They told us that I was the chosen child, and immediately I thought, well, I don't think the chosen child story is so honest, That's sort of put together anyway. But she was talking about them being honest. I think in most adoptive families that there was a loss of honesty. And it might not be about, they might come up there and tell them, okay, you're adopted. But that isn't exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about private feelings they have about whether they see the child different than their own. And I think that's hard for adoptive parents to recognize. David Kirk is somebody that I read a while ago, and I think he's great. I guess a lot of you know him. He talks about, the same or different. And that there is differences, and I suspect adoptive parents aren't real free to acknowledge the differences, and I think they're better off if they do. So I think there's always certain kind of white lies or bigger lies in the adoptive relationship. What if the loss isn't confronted? I'll stop with this, I guess, that I don't think there's a study that and it's probably be one to do, where it took 100 adoptees, and here's 100 adoptees that have searched, thought about it, grieved losses, and so forth, and compare them to 100 adoptees that say it's no big deal, and see, if there's a difference. There's probably something that can be done. I don't think that's been done, as far as I know. I can look at myself, and I can say empirically, from an observation of my own experience, therapeutically, it seems to me, there is an inverse relationship between the amount of sadness you experience about the adoption issues, I guess, or maybe life in general, and your level of self-esteem. That the more you confront these things and see them as sad and grieve something, in general, the better you feel about yourself. People agree with that? It seems to me that works that way. I can look at myself before and after. We can't compare 100 people. I guess I can compare me. 8 or 9 years ago, I didn't cry very much about anything, and I wasn't sad very much, okay? And I didn't feel particularly good about myself. I feel better about myself now, and I'm sad all the time. All the time. Almost any sad story will get me crying, And frankly, if you got a choice between those two positions, I'd rather be in the sad position and feel kind of okay than the other way around. Yeah.
Don't you think that has to do with letting go of the denial and not having your self-esteem based on so much denial?
Yeah, it's a part of it, I guess. I think there's a whole lot more to it than that. Yeah.
I am sitting here praying that this tape turns out, because my son is going to get married in July, the son that I found, and I'm not invited to the wedding, and my son denies that he has any particular kind of issues with adoption, and resents the fact that I ever bring up adoption in any particular form of conversation with him. And I want this tape so bad to give to his future wife, because she's going to need it real bad. And you have all been so informative that if she ever wants to know anything about adoption, I'm sure the three of you will inform her for the rest of her life.
I think that people...
I really wanted to be her wedding present without him even knowing.
In counseling, you keep it in mind that it's important, but you don't have to be in a therapeutic relationship. If you're involved with an adoptee, then I think, still you make the assumption that this is probably important. If they say it isn't, you take them at their word at that point in time, but you consider that it possibly is. And maybe there'll be another time when it makes sense for them to see it that way.
I think there's another loss that happens too, talking about spouses. And the spouses of adoptees, like lots of other environments, have a difficult time understanding because they haven't experienced that. They come from natural families often, and they don't. And they have to live those losses with us. And we force it upon them. I mean, we live in the same household and we're with these people. And so they're having to live losses which they haven't really had the experience to understand. So I don't know how to deal with that one. I have trouble dealing with my wife on that issue. She thinks I'm crazy.
Does she go to support group meetings with you?
No.
That would help, I think, if she could hear other people. Sometimes you never believe your husband, but somebody else can say the same thing and you do.
I wanted to comment for a second about one of Bob's closing statements about the honesty issues within adoptive families. I talked earlier about some of the inherent paradoxes in this whole process for all of us. We're all living double speak, if you will, in a variety of ways as adoptees and birth parents and adoptive parents. But when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the real double bind here, because if you acknowledge as adoptive parents the truth, in a sense the statement that your aunt made about you're not really a member of the family, which was also hurtful to you, one of the things that happens, it goes back to David Kirk's, one of his dilemmas of how do you integrate a child into your family and make them feel like a full family member at the same time that you're telling them that they come from another family. And I just have to tell you what a delicate road that is for an adoptive parent in terms of being honest. Because if on the one hand you're saying, we love you, we feel about you as a son or a daughter, we consider you a precious member of this family, and we want to relate to you as honest parents, and therefore we also acknowledge that you are not in this family the same way as perhaps your peers are connected to their family, then you set up that same bind that I think you articulated so well, because you kind of can't win with your kids. No matter how honest you are or how loving you are, there is a loss inherent in how that very system is set up.
I guess my reaction to that is that I would go in the direction of you have an adoptive relationship, and that isn't more or less. It's different.
It's different.
And you can love an adoptive child just as much, okay, but differently. And so you have an authentic adoptive relationship.
And I think that works better for us as adults, and it's real tough when you're growing up and you're trying to process that from a cognitive level that it doesn't make sense. I mean, it just, I think it's a real double bind. And I agree with what you said, absolutely.
One thing Ken Watson says that was very helpful for me, and I've used it in talking with prospective adoptive parents, as an adoptee, not for anything else, and that is that we have bonding and we have attachment. There may be two different things. You can't have bonding, but you can't have attachment. You might want bonding, but you can't have it. But you can't have attachment. And maybe if it starts with that, then the difference can be acknowledged. And maybe you can, in fact, be empowered to have the attachments. And that's because my dad told me, his paradox to me was, we always wanted a child. To me, that's very paradoxical. They had a child, and that's what he wanted. He didn't want to keep the child. He didn't want an adult. And his response to it was not the nursing home management fund. I'm a trustee of his trust, but I'm not the beneficiary of his trust. I'm not a will. And that was his final answer. And I suspect he just never reaped you know, deal with.
I have a question. Do you feel that there is a spiritual bonding between a mother and a child? Because, I mean, intellectually, if you take the child and put him in a home where supposedly all his needs are met, now this ideal home, then why then is there this hunger to find the birth mother? And it's in the birth mother too, I believe. I really feel there's a spiritual bonding or an emotional bonding, and I think the thing that's so has been so sad is after reunion with my son too, is to find that even though all of his needs were met intellectually, materialistically, and all of this, I mean, it was very destructive to separate, to break this spiritual or this emotional bond. And I feel that there is a real strong bond there, that it's a spiritual bond.
Someone?
I think there are a couple of facts of all of our lives, is that the severing of that primal bond is damaging for the mother, is damaging for the child. I mean, adoptees start out on life, their first mark in life is goodbye. So when you talk about how we don't get into relationships or how we have difficulties in the long term, the other loss that really has been startling for me, being at this conference and sort of where I am in my reunion, is I think that sometimes we're reticent to deal with our anger around relinquishment, and then what happens, we push that to the secondary person being the birth father. And workshops at this conference, talk of birth fathers, it's sort of like they don't exist. I feel that they're disenfranchised from this organization even. And I'm saying, where are the birth fathers? I'm an adoptee who's not been able to have a relationship with my birth mother because she's dead. And so, but even still, it took me a year to contact my birth father. And now that I have, that relationship has been very healing in ways that I never thought possible. And I don't hear anybody talking about this. I don't see anything happening. So I think that for adoptees, there is like that other piece of loss. I don't think we're encouraged to develop relationships in that area.
There is an individual, John Bryan.
He's not here.
Right.
I want to comment to you that I think it gets shoved first at the adoptive mother. And as I travel, I can say that the anger that's felt about the abandonment, the relinquishment, the separation is first put at the other mother. Because very often the first person you think of that created the break is the birth mother. And since she's not around to deal with, particularly as a child growing up, a lot of it gets transferred right back into the adoptive family and becomes some of the angst between the adoptive mother and the child.
Sharon, when you said that it's a very touchy situation about how you try to handle it with an adoptee, that, you know, they are in the family, but yet they're not born from it. But the way that you explained it, you know, I thought that was good because, you know, that's telling the adoptee the truth, and it's not saying things that are fake. And even though it's touchy of how you would tell them in that way, at least it's the truth. And then also, like many adoptive families, if the adoptive parents try to deny that of how you explained it, and so if they say, oh, you're just like one of our natural children, and, you know, just forget about the adoption and all this and that, the denial. If I were an adoptee, and I mean, I feel like this about adoptees, I feel like that is not giving the adoptee the right to feel that very special, I mean, they're very unique just by the fact that they are an adoptee. And even though it's a lot of hurt in their life, I mean, they shouldn't be denied that special, unique feeling, you know, that they are different than raised as a natural child. And I think the more the truth is practiced in the adoptive family, then that'll help the adoptee not to feel like they're being denied their own special feelings.
I agree. And I also think that a lot of this stuff is so subtle, as Bob was saying, that it's amazing. I said earlier, for those of you who came in later, that the 12 children that we parented, none of them came home as babies except the one that I gave birth to. And so their experiences came home with them in terms of their birth families and so on. So we didn't have some of the denial issues within our family that might have been played out with some of the other adoptive families that I interface with. But one of the things I was aware of is the games that the kids used to play that dealt more with the senses that allowed them to know their differences. And one of the things that struck me a few years ago was having a garage sale. All the kids were gone into the world, and the only child that happened to be home to help us with this was our oldest child, who was the one by birth. So she had come down, and we had laundered all the clothes, you know how you do for a garage sale, and they were all sitting out by size. And as people were kind of ruffling through them, our oldest daughter was picking up sweaters and things, and she said, "This one is Josh. This one is Tammy. This one's Carlene." I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Oh, it just feels good to sniff the sweaters because I can tell the differences between all my siblings." She said, "You know, Mom, none of them smell the same. And the only one that smells like you is me." Now, this was our 28-year-old daughter. Now, she just blew me away. And I said, she said, "We used to play these games all the time, Mom." She said, "The kids, we would, growing up, talk about the subtle differences between us in our voices." She said, "You know, like when we would answer the phone, the only time that we got mixed up on the phone between you and somebody else in the family was me, Mom. But all the other kids, we would try to imitate you. We would have games like that." But, you know, if you give kids that latitude, which happened a lot in our family because of the older kids coming home, they pick up those subtleties and are able to articulate the losses in a way that sometimes none of us talk about quite in that way. That was a real reminder for me of those kind of acknowledgement of differences that they made fun with, actually.
I can relate to your senses when you're talking about games. Myself, as an adoptee, I remember as a child I really liked soft things. I mean, I know everybody likes to touch soft things, but for me, I had everything that my gifts were all soft, and the sweater had to be soft. And they knew that the others weren't like that, you know. It had to be soft, and I think for me that was something real. To touch something, it's real, like flicking a light on and off. You know that's never going to go away. That light switch is always going to be on the door. But relationships go away, and they hurt so much, you know. Like even with friends, you lose friends, you lose a parent, you lose family, whatever. It hurts so much. They go away. There's no guarantee. But there's a guarantee that when I touch that thing, it's going to be soft. When I smell that sweater, it's going to smell like Josh or whatever, you know. So just,
yeah. Connections to life.
Yeah.
Hi, Penny.
Sharon, what do you think about saying as an adoptive parent to your child, you have two real families. You have our family in one way and you have another family in another way. And that acknowledges the difference between the two and it makes them both real.
I'm 100% for that, but then I'm a total advocate for open adoption, so my belief is that the birth family should be connected anyway. See, my belief is that you don't do an adoption by losing a family to gain a family. You just marry the families and you work that out.
Adoption, you can still say that.
Oh, absolutely. There has to be that acknowledgement. Absolutely.
I want to just say, agree with that. You've helped me a lot. It's really good to have the triad all together because it just makes things so much easier to put in perspective that we work together and that we do have, everybody has their own hurts. And when we come together and we can bond with one another, we really can become very strong people. And just learn that our experience is different, but it's also a beautiful experience. We meet a lot of people, and you know, you can look at it as well. There's two women in my life, I mean, it's endless with the families and stuff, and how many relationships we can have. It's kind of scary in a way sometimes when you think about it, but it's also a really beautiful thing. And finding out all the different things about physical and environmental, I don't know, it's pretty interesting, and I just wanted to thank you.
Thanks.
Last chance. Going.
I just wanted to ask you, where, I'm confused, where were you originally born?
Milwaukee, apparently. I don't know that. I'm pretty sure.
I just wanted to make a comment that we're dealing with losses and grief, and all those things are associated with love. And a very wise adoptive mother said to me once, love is not a pie that when you give away all the pieces, you're done with love. The love is something that continues to grow, and that when we ask parents if they can love more than their child, they always say yes. We need to begin to recognize with birth parents and adoptive parents and adoptees that they can love more than one set of parents, and they can love more than just one person.
Right.
And that we all have to start getting rid of that fear of losing love in this process of searching out
Right,
love.
right, right. Yeah, the first note I ever wrote to my daughter, I was very afraid of overwhelming her because of my excitement. But I remember saying, you can never have too much love. So how could I be a burden, right? I probably am, but...
Somebody mentioned birth fathers earlier, and I'm putting out a plea again. I made one yesterday. If anybody has knowledge of a birth father / therapist at the conference, I'd very much like to know that person. So if you are here or you know that person is here, I'd very much like to know that.
Thank you.
Thank you.